The Chinese often claim that October 25, 1945 was Taiwan Retrocession Day. In other words, they like to say that the Japanese surrender ceremonies held on that date in Taipei amounted to a transfer of sovereignty over Formosa and the Pescadores to China. In support of this claim, the Chinese typically reference the Cairo Declaration, a non-binding press release, issued unilaterally on December 1, 1943, by a group of 3 belligerents: President Chiang Kai-shek of the Republic of China, President Franklin Roosevelt of the USA, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom. The Cairo Declaration was the outcome of the Cairo Conference in Cairo, Egypt, in late November 1943. At that time, victory over the Japanese was not at all assured, and the Allies needed various propaganda instruments for short-term mobilizations of support. The Japanese were advancing steadily in mainland Chinese territory, and many US government officials feared that the Chinese military officers might ask for early peace negotiations in the China theater. If that scenario came to pass, large numbers of Japanese soldiers would be freed up and redeployed into the Pacific theater, much to the detriment of the USA. Hence, keeping Chiang Kai-shek happy was an important short-term priority. Many scholars would argue that the Cairo Declaration is not, in the formal sense, a legal document. It was not ratified, and indeed, the missions of the 3 representatives probably did not have authorizations to conclude any formal policy revisions of such scope. Yet, still other scholars would argue the opposite. The controversy between the different viewpoints has raged since the early 1950s, which is over 60 years. What is the correct way to interpret the effect of this declaration on the events of October 25, 1945? What were the announced views of the leading government officials at that time? An examination of the Act of Surrender in the China Theatre, held in Nanking on September 9, 1945, and all related surrender documents, as well as published statements of the Allies in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, etc., can certainly help us to illuminate the situation in a much clearer fashion.
The following are 5 items of proof to say that October 25, 1945 was not Taiwan Retrocession Day. Number 1. The surrender was limited to Japanese forces.
The Act of Surrender in the China Theatre, held in Nanking on September 9, 1945, and Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Order No. 1, issued in Tokyo on September 2, 1945, authorized the surrender of Japanese forces, not Japanese territories. The Act of Surrender in the China Theatre and General Order No. 1 were military directives, establishing procedures for demobilizing Japanese forces. They were not meant to settle political issues. The content of these military directives, and in particular the assignment of members of the Allied coalition to disarm Japanese forces in certain areas, in no way implied that the members had any rights to permanent possession over those areas in the future.
Number 2. Japanese versus Chinese nationality status.
Beginning in 1946, the Foreign Relations of the United States series has many entries regarding the legal status of Taiwan and its residents.
Aide-memoire. The U.S. Department of State to the Chinese Embassy, Washington, D.C. Date: November 21, 1946. Subject: Status of Taiwanese persons in Japan.
It should, however, be pointed out that from the legal standpoint, the transfer of Taiwan's sovereignty remains to be formalized. Assumably, a treaty of cession will, in due course, be negotiated, which will effect such transfer, and which may contain provisions in regard to appropriate change in the national status of Taiwan's residents.
Number 3. Taiwan still belongs to Japan.
The earliest report on Taiwan's legal status by the United States National Security Council was issued in 1949.
Draft report by the National Security Council. Date January 19, 1949. Subject US policy with respect to Formosa and the Pescadores.
The present legal status of Formosa and the Pescadores is that they are a portion of the Japanese Empire awaiting final disposition by a treaty of peace. The US position regarding the status of the islands is qualified by the Cairo Declaration, by the chiefs of state of the US, UK and China, and the policy which the US has followed since VJ Day of facilitating and recognizing Chinese de facto control over the islands.
Number 4. The Korean War and Taiwan.
After the outbreak of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, President Truman declared that the neutralization of the Straits of Formosa was the best interest of the United States, and he sent the US Navy's 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent any conflict between the Republic of China and the Red China, effectively putting Taiwan under American protection. It was known by US government officials that if Taiwan was already recognized as Chinese national territory, there would be no legal basis for the President to authorize such an action by the 7th Fleet.
On August 25, 1950, the United States replied to the United Nations Security Council that
the action of the United States was expressly stated to be without prejudice to the future political settlement of the status of the island. The actual status of the island is that it is territory taken from Japan by the victory of the Allied forces in the Pacific. Like other such territories, its legal status cannot be fixed until there is international action to determine its future. The Chinese government was asked by the Allies to take the surrender of the Japanese forces on the island. That is the reason the Chinese are there now.
Number 5. Future arrangements for Formosa.
It is also quite notable that US Department of State documents from as late as August 14, 1950 contain the following commentary and recommendation. In 1944, as a result of the work of a policy planning committee in the department, it was decided that Formosa should be handed over to the Chinese national government immediately following upon the termination of hostilities. I believe that the immediate administrative act affecting the turnover was a military order handing it over to Chinese administration after the surrender of Japan. From the legal standpoint, of course, title could hardly pass prior to determination of the matter by a peace treaty with Japan, the Cairo Declaration being merely a statement of intent. It is more and more being considered desirable in the existing circumstances that there be taken some plebiscite of Formosan opinion respecting the future form of government and allegiance in Formosa, with the several following alternatives suggesting themselves: allegiance to Japan, allegiance to China regardless of political complexion, immediate independence, or a UN trusteeship for a stipulated period of years, looking toward ultimate independence.